There is a whisper that inhabits the silences between our deepest thoughts, a voice not heard with the ears, but felt with the soul. It's the echo of something many have forgotten, but that has never extinguished, the memory that we are more than mortal bodies transiting through a material world. The greatest tragedy of humanity was not man's fall, but the forgetting of his origin. How many walk through life trying to find meaning in ready-made formulas, in external doctrines, without ever realizing that the true revelation is where few dare to look, within themselves. The existential void that torments millions is not a flaw, but a call to return to the Christ consciousness, to that spark that never separated from the divine mind, but that was buried under layers of beliefs, fears, and conditionings imposed over the centuries. The metaphor of the torn veil in the temple, described in the Gospels after the death of Jesus, was never just a historical or symbolic event marking the end of a religious era. It's a spiritual code, a key for those who have eyes to see. The veil represents the illusory separation between the human and the divine, between the outer temple and the inner sanctuary. To tear this veil is to dissolve the lie that God dwells only in the distant heavens or in elevated figures. It's to acknowledge that the eternal Spirit quietly resides in the heart of every being, waiting to be rediscovered. Christ did not die to create a religion. He died to show that the death of the ego reveals the eternal life that already pulses within us. What has been taught to us for generations as a bloody sacrifice is, in fact, the description of an initiatory process of spiritual rebirth. But why, even with so much access to information and spirituality, do so many still live, lost, anxious, disconnected? Because the greatest prison that exists is invisible. It doesn't have iron bars, but rather distorted concepts about who we are. We were taught to worship external images and forget the internal essence, to seek salvation in dogmas and ignore the living presence within us. The truth is that most people don't reject the divine, but rather the caricature of the divine that was imposed on them. Therefore, the true gospel will never be found only in written words, but rather in lived experiences. It is not confined to the pages of a book, but throbs in the heart that dares to be quiet enough to hear it. Christ, as consciousness, is a state of remembrance, an acknowledgement of our eternal origin and our spiritual identity beyond form. It is not a character frozen in history, but an active vibration available to anyone who wishes to strip away illusions and touch reality. This consciousness makes no distinction between saints and sinners, between masters and learners. It is like the sun, shining on everyone, without exception. However, it is necessary for each of us to draw back the curtains of the mind so that the light can enter. The invitation from Christ consciousness is not for us to become something new, but to stop being what we are not. To let fall the characters, the titles, the masks. And in this abandonment, we may discover the true face of being. The journey towards Christ consciousness does not start with rituals or speeches, but with an inner restlessness, a sacred discomfort that says, "There is more than this." This dissatisfaction, often mistaken for failure or emptiness, is in fact the first sign of awakening. It's the soul beginning to remember who it is. It's the start of the return home. And like every spiritual journey, this path will not be trodden with feet, but with the abandonment of certainties, with the courage to question what we have been taught, with the willingness to die to the old identity and allow something greater to emerge from the silence. For centuries, the concept of Christ has been used as a tool of power, fear, and control. But those who tap into the essence behind the name discover something radically liberating. Christ is not an external savior, but the very nature of the awakened being. It is the union of the human mind with the divine mind. It is the end of duality. It is the state where there is no longer a separation between creator and creature. When this perception settles in, everything changes. Not because the world out there transforms, but because the way one sees the world is transmuted by the light of inner clarity. And this clarity does not come from reason, but from stillness. Tearing the veil is an act of courage. It means confronting the deepest fears, the most ingrained attachments, the oldest lies. It's facing one's own emptiness without despair, knowing that this emptiness is not absence, but a fertile space where the divine presence can flourish. Masters from all traditions have pointed to this inner place, but few have listened. For as long as one seeks outside what already exists within, the veil will continue to cover the eyes of the soul. The return to Christ consciousness is therefore a process of stripping away, a unlearning, a return to the original purity of being. On this path, there is no need for intermediaries. The divine mind communicates directly with those willing to listen with their heart. It does not speak in human language, but in insights, in deep peace, in love without reason. The gospel of the divine mind is not preached, it is embodied. It is not memorized, it is lived. When this is understood, all the weight of religious demands dissolves, giving way to a sacred simplicity. It is in this space that the consciousness of Christ reveals itself, in the lightness of being, in silent compassion, in the presence that observes everything without judgment. The call to live this consciousness is personal, non-transferable. It is not possible to outsource one's own enlightenment, and that's why so many people run away from this call, because it demands responsibility. It requires the abandonment of victimization. It requires the willingness to dive into the unknown, but the reward is unimaginable. It is the freedom that does not depend on external circumstances. It is the abundance that is not based on numbers, but on inner fullness. It is the wisdom that does not come from books, but from the direct connection with the source. Everyone who feels this call knows intuitively that the external world can never fulfill the inner longing. That no achievement, no matter how great, can replace the peace of being aligned with one's own truth. And when this connection is restored, everything around changes. Relationships, purposes, desires. Life ceases to be a race and becomes a dance. A flow where the divine mind moves effortlessly, through every gesture, word, and silence. This is the living gospel, no longer a doctrine to be taught, but a presence to be manifested. Therefore, whoever hears this call is not going mad. They are awakening. Those who feel disconnected from traditional religion, but deeply drawn to something they cannot name, are hearing the voice of truth whispering behind the noise of the world. This voice does not impose, does not threaten, does not demand. It invites to return, to recognition, to the remembrance that Christ consciousness is not something to be achieved in the future, but something that is already pulsing now, waiting to be rediscovered. The veil has already been torn. The only remaining question is, are you willing to see? The human mind, as powerful as it may be, has become a dusty mirror, reflecting distorted images of reality. What we often call identity is nothing more than a cluster of memories, inherited beliefs, and social conditionings accumulated throughout life. Therefore, when we speak of the divine mind, many cannot immediately comprehend it. They try to understand it with the same rational mechanisms that uphold their limitations. However, God's mind cannot be captured, explained, or analyzed. It can only be perceived, experienced, and above all, remembered. For it is not something separate from us, but the very essence of what we are. Within every human being pulses an eternal spark, a fragment of the infinite that carries the pure memory of the source. This spark is not symbolic, it is real. It is what remains when everything illusory dissolves. The biblical assertion that we were created in the image and likeness of God carries a profound truth, but one that has been reduced to superficiality by centuries of misinterpretation. It is not about a physical image, but a vibrational correspondence. Just as a drop contains the composition of the ocean, the human being contains in its essence the same substance of the divine mind. This mind does not think as we think, it does not calculate as we calculate, it does not judge as we judge. It simply is. And in its state of being, it creates, loves, expands, and sustains everything that exists. Christ consciousness is the recognition of this truth not with the intellect, but with the totality of being. It is an alignment so deep with the source that all masks fall, all doubts dissipate, and all that remains is the absolute presence, the luminous silence, the formless I am. Modern science, particularly in the fields of quantum physics and neuroscience, has begun to touch, albeit timidly, on the limits of matter and the boundaries of consciousness. Theories such as the unified field, quantum entanglement, and non-locality point to a reality where everything is interconnected, where separation is merely an illusion of perception. This understanding, which mystics from all traditions have been affirming for millennia, is now beginning to be confirmed by experiments. The unified field of consciousness, of which the divine mind is the matrix, is not outside of us. It is accessed through elevated states of consciousness, where the ego temporarily dissolves and perception expands beyond time, space, and the body. It is in this field that the true nature of Christ consciousness can be experienced as a frequency of pure unity, unconditional love, and living wisdom. Christ, therefore, is not just a name or a historical figure. He is a cosmic archetype, a universal frequency that inhabits the energetic structure of the universe and of human beings. All great spiritual masters who have manifested wisdom, compassion, and spiritual power in their fullness were vibrating in this consciousness. Jesus was the purest and most direct manifestation of this frequency, but not the only one. Christ is the matrix of the awakened being, the one who transcends the ego and lives in unity with the whole. When one connects with this frequency, they do not become better or more spiritual, but rather more truthful, more authentic, more whole. The spiritual ego, which seeks superiority, cannot coexist with the divine mind. For in this mind, there is no separation, no comparison, no judgment, only presence. The divine mind is not accessed through effort or merit. It is not a reward for the purest or for those who follow religious rules. It is inherent to the being. It has always been there. It always will be. What blocks this perception is the identification with the false self, with the conditioned mind that lives in the past or the future, which feeds on fear and desire. The mind of God, on the contrary, is eternally anchored in the present, where time does not exist and where the being reveals itself in its entirety. It is not necessary to accumulate knowledge to touch this mind. On the contrary, often it is necessary to unlearn, to let go, to relinquish control. The divine mind reveals itself in surrender, in deep trust that we are not separated from the source, but living expressions of it. Within the human soul, there are records as old as the universe itself. These are cosmic memories that hold the wisdom of creation, the paths tread by other consciousnesses, the ancestral learnings that still echo in our dreams, intuitions, and premonitions. These records are not lost, just obscured, and when the human mind begins to align with the divine mind, these records naturally begin to emerge, like sacred memories that awaken and guide. The Christ consciousness is not an exceptional state, but the memory of what we always were before the fall into separation. By accessing this state, we do not acquire something new. We simply remove what prevented us from seeing what has always been present. When we gaze at the starry sky, we feel an inexplicable longing, a nostalgia that cannot be filled with anything of this world. It's the call of eternity. It's the silent reminder that we belong to something much larger than the limited narrative of the ego. This sacred nostalgia is an inner map, a compass pointing towards the divine mind. Each time we fall silent, each time we choose forgiveness over resentment, gratitude over complaint, love over fear, we tune into this mind. It's a subtle process, invisible to the world's eyes, but one that radically transforms our vibration and, with it, our entire reality. It's not about replacing one belief system with another, but about transcending them all. The Christ consciousness cannot be confined to any religion, because it precedes them all. It predates time, predates history. It's the code of creation. It's the frequency of absolute love. Therefore, true awakening doesn't happen when you learn something new, but when you recognize what has always been silently pulsating at the core of your soul. And this recognition is not a product of effort, but of surrender, of complete surrender to the present moment, where the divine mind reveals itself without masks, without resistance, without limits. The mirror of the mind, when cleared of all judgments, expectations, and fears, reflects the image of Christ, not the religious, institutionalized Christ, but the living, internal Christ, who breathes through every atom, who vibrates in every cell, who speaks through intuition, who loves through silence. When this reflection is recognized, the human being stops seeking God externally and starts embodying the divine in every gesture, in every word, in every intention. This is the beginning of a new life, not based on external achievements, but on internal communion. Life ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a sacred garden where the divine mind blossoms in its purest expression. The Christ consciousness is the alignment between heart, mind, and spirit. It's the dissolution of the duality that divides and separates. It's the reconnection with the whole that integrates and unifies. There is no longer a struggle between good and evil, between right and wrong. There is only discernment, clarity, and peace. This clarity doesn't come from logical reasoning, but from the wisdom that emanates from the center of being. A wisdom that recognizes the sacredness of all things, even those that the ego judges as error or failure. The divine mind sees purpose where the common mind sees chaos. And by uniting with this mind, the human being also begins to see with new eyes, hear with new ears, feel with new depth. This is the invitation that the consciousness of Christ makes, to remember unity, to become a clear mirror of the divine mind, to open oneself to the truth that liberates, not by imposition, but by revelation. The revelation that does not occur at the top of a mountain, but in the silence of the heart. That does not impose itself with shouts, but whispers with tenderness. That does not demand proof, but awakens internal certainties. The mind of God is in us. It always has been. It never left. It only waits for us to be ready to see it with the eyes of the soul, to feel its presence in every breath, and to allow it to guide every step of the way. The most sophisticated prison ever built has no walls, no cells, nor bars. It resides within the mind, imperceptible, camouflaged as identity, protected by layers of automatic thoughts and unobserved emotions. It is the prison of the ego, a psychic structure so intricate and subtle that most people live their entire lives without even suspecting its presence, believing it to be themselves. The ego is not just pride or vanity. It is the entire construction of a personality disconnected from the essence. It is the defense system born from the fear of death and separation. An illusory entity that operates as if it were real, but whose existence depends solely on the ignorance of the being about its true nature. The ego is the silent impostor that seizes the throne of consciousness, declaring itself king, when in fact it is nothing more than a usurper who fears being discovered. This false self is a master at creating narratives. It feeds on stories about the past, about unresolved pains, about achievements that define personal worth. It projects a future where salvation is always one step ahead, never in the now. In doing this, the ego ensures its survival, for it can only exist in the absence of presence. The divine mind, by its nature, only inhabits the now, the eternal present, where there is no room for the ego to hide. The ego is fragmentation, it is division, it is a program running in the background, shaped by traumas, by culture, by education, by all the experiences that the being interpreted as real. It says, I am this or I am that, when in fact the I am does not need compliments. The true I am is pure consciousness, free of form, free of role, free of time. When a person claims to be what they feel, what they think, what they possess, or what they have suffered, they are operating under the domain of the ego. This mechanism is so persuasive that it even convinces spiritual seekers that they are awakened, when in fact they have merely switched characters. The spiritual ego is one of the most dangerous, as it wears the mask of humility, wisdom, and compassion, while secretly feeding on superiority, control, and recognition. It is the one that seeks enlightenment not to dissolve into the whole, but to stand out from the whole. It is the divided mind pretending to be one. And until this disguise is revealed, the being remains trapped in the illusion, even believing they have freed themselves. The true challenge of the spiritual path is not ascension, but descent. The descent into the basements of the psyche, where the denied, rejected, repressed aspects reside, where the ego has built its fortresses. The light of the divine mind does not forcefully eliminate these shadows. It illuminates them, revealing their falsity. When the being begins to observe its thoughts without identifying with them, when it notices its emotional reactions without judging them, when it perceives repetitive patterns without getting lost in them, the process of disidentification begins. Consciousness shifts from the ego and returns to its original position as an observer. At this moment, the prison begins to crumble. The usurped throne is returned to its rightful occupant, the being. The ego is essentially resistance. It resists change, impermanence, the unknown. It prefers familiar pain to the void that precedes truth. It is fear dressing up as control, organizing life to ensure predictability, security, and permanence. But everything that is controlled is dead. Real life is flow, it is surrender, it is yielding. The divine mind does not need to control, for it is at peace with what is, not because it is passive, but because it is powerful enough to transform without fighting. When the human mind lets go of the need to control life, the ego loses its strength. It is in this space of surrender that the miracle happens. The being returns to the inner home where it never ceased to be, but had forgotten. The deconstruction of the ego is not an event, it's a process. A continuous process of dying and being reborn every moment. Each challenging situation is an opportunity to reveal the ego and dissolve it in the light of presence. Every conflict uncovers a part of the mind that still believes it is separate. Every judgment exposes an unhealed pain that cries out for attention. When one begins to live in this way, everyday life becomes a field for spiritual practice. There's no need to retreat to a monastery or live in isolation. It's possible to awaken in the midst of traffic, in a bank queue, amid the chaos of the modern world. Because the ego is not outside, it's inside, and it's within where liberation occurs. It's important to understand that the ego is not the enemy. It is simply a misinterpreted mechanism. It emerged to protect the human being from pain, insecurity, and the unknown. At its core, it is an attempt by the psyche to stay safe. But like any guardian who forgets its original role, it has come to dominate the territory it was meant to only protect. When clearly and compassionately understood, the ego can be reintegrated into the wholeness of being as a tool, not as a master. The divine mind does not fight the ego, it transcends it. It observes it, understands it, and dissolves it in presence. The return to Christ consciousness therefore requires vigilance, a continuous attention to the movements of the mind, to the impulses of the ego, to the traps of the character. It requires internal silence to listen beyond the voices of the world. It requires courage to face the densest parts of the soul. But this vigilance is not tension, it is love. A love so profound that it chooses to see the truth, even when it is uncomfortable. A love that does not seek to blame, but understands the causes. That does not feed separation, but heals through unity. When this loving vigilance is established, the ego loses the power to command. It may still arise, but it no longer deceives. And in this clarity, the divine mind reemerges as the true ruler. The divine mind is like a vast and silent sky, and the ego are the fleeting clouds. For a long time, we believed ourselves to be the clouds, ignoring the immensity of the sky. But the sky never ceased to be there. It just patiently waited for us to remember to look beyond. This remembrance is the first step of awakening. And once you have glimpsed this inner sky, even for a brief moment, no experience can replace it. The search for external meaning becomes obsolete as the source of life begins to emanate from within. Peace ceases to be a goal and becomes the natural state of being. The dissolution of the ego is not a loss. It is the greatest liberation possible. It is the end of striving to be someone. It is the beginning of being real, of being formless, nameless, without a story. A being that doesn't need to prove anything to anyone, that doesn't seek recognition, that doesn't cling to the past, that doesn't fear the future. This being is the pure expression of the divine mind. It doesn't act out of scarcity, but out of abundance. It doesn't speak to convince, but to share. It doesn't walk to arrive, but because it is the path itself. When the ego silences, the inner Christ begins to speak, and the world listens. It listens not with the ears, but with the awakened heart. It is in this state that the gospel of the divine mind comes alive, no longer as written words, but as an emanated vibration. The presence of someone who inhabits the Christ consciousness transforms environments, heals invisible wounds, awakens ancestral memories. It's not magic, it's frequency, a frequency that dissolves fear, that softens time, that reveals eternity in each moment. This is the legacy that Christ left us, not as something distant, but as a present, real possibility, accessible to all. The prison of the ego only persists as long as we do not recognize the freedom we already are. In the constant noise of the modern world, where notifications vie for attention with relentless obligations and external voices overshadow the whispers of the soul, silence has become not only rare, but feared. However, it is in this quiet space that truth rests, untouched, waiting to be rediscovered. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of that which is eternal. It does not represent emptiness, but fullness. It is in silence that the divine mind communicates directly, without filters, without articulated language, without the need for interpretation. It is the sacred ground where all distraction dissolves and the self is seen naked in its own light. The moment the noise of the mind quiets, the veil that separated man from his origin begins to dissolve, revealing the indescribable beauty of union with the whole. Awakening in silence is the first step to reintegrate with what has never ceased to be. The experience of awakening does not begin with a grand revelation, but with small instances of presence. Brief moments when, for some inexplicable reason, time seems to stop, thoughts cease, and a deep peace settles in. These moments are sparks of reality piercing through the illusion. The conditioned mind tends to dismiss them as irrelevant, but they are precious gateways. They are like slivers of light in a dark room, indicating that a bright sun is shining outside. When you start to value these spaces of inner quiet, the being is naturally drawn inward, where the Christ consciousness resides. Awakening is, essentially, the movement of return to the center, to the origin, to the pure essence that observes everything, but is not confused with anything. Silence does not require effort, it requires surrender. It's not about silencing strength, but allowing the noise to cease on its own. Silence is the natural state of being before the interference of thoughts. It is prior to language, interpretation, narrative. In deep silence, there is no longer an I separated from the whole. There is only consciousness witnessing what is, in full acceptance, in absolute rest. And it is in this rest that the presence of the inner Christ begins to reveal itself, not as an idea, but as a living reality. It is in this silent field that the divine mind can operate freely, without resistance. Silence is the inner temple where the ego cannot enter. It dissolves when trying to cross it, as there is nothing there that it can manipulate. The practice of stillness, meditation, contemplation are not mere spiritual techniques. They are ways to reconnect with the sacred. Each time someone sits in silence, closes their eyes, and turns inward, they are embarking on a sacred journey. It doesn't matter if the mind is still restless, if thoughts continue to arise. The intention to be silent is already a movement of return. And even in the internal noise, there is something that observes in silence. This something is the real presence. By recognizing this silent observer, the process of shifting identity from the ego to the being begins. It is at this point that reintegration with the whole begins to occur, not as a concept, but as a direct experience. This process is not immediate, nor is it linear. There are days when silence will open up like a calm and welcoming ocean. On others, it will seem distant, unreachable. But each attempt is a step, each conscious breath, a return. Each moment of presence, a victory over illusion. The conditioned mind will scream, protest, seek distractions. But the heart knows. The heart recognizes the path. The heart is the altar where the divine spark never went out. And it is through the heart that the language of silence is heard. A language that is not made of words but of vibrations. A direct communication between the soul and the infinite. Great masters, saints, and enlightened ones from all eras have found the truth in silence. Siddhartha Gautama sat under a tree and silenced himself until all illusion was dissolved. Jesus withdrew to the desert, to secluded places, seeking direct contact with the Father. St. John of the Cross wrote about the dark night of the soul, where all artificial lights go out so that the true light can emerge. Rumi danced in silence with the mystery. Lao Tzu plunged into the quietude of the Tao. And so, generation after generation, those who dared to be silent in the face of the sacred were the ones who spoke most deeply to the world. Because silence, when full, becomes word. It becomes creation. It becomes revelation. In silence, the deep wounds of the soul begin to heal, not because they are forgotten, but because they are finally seen. Without judgment, without defense, without escape. The silent presence is the balm that heals effortlessly. It touches what the mind cannot reach, dissolves what time cannot erase. The light of the inner Christ, when accessed in this space, reveals not only our essence, but also the meaning of everything we have ever lived. All the pains, all the stumbles, all the falls, reorganize into a tapestry of learning that leads to awakening. Nothing was in vain. Everything served the purpose of the return. It is common that, upon touching these states of profound silence, a feeling of home arises, a sense of belonging that no external experience has been able to provide. It's the recognition of origin, the end of the search, the end of the feeling of being lost. The divine mind, when it manifests in this silence, does not bring rational explanations, but unquestionable certainties. A wisdom that cannot be taught, only accessed. And this access is the greatest gift one can give oneself, the reunion with what has always been inside, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Awakening does not eliminate the external world, but transforms the way it is perceived. What once caused suffering is now seen clearly. What once seemed threatening reveals itself as a master. Chaos transforms into subtle order, because now there is a center, an inner core from which everything is observed with serenity. The cultivated silence becomes the basis of a new reality, where the divine mind guides the steps, the words, the decisions. Life begins to flow in harmony, not because the challenges disappear, but because there is an inner strength that transcends them all. Waking up in silence is, therefore, the beginning of reintegration with the whole. It is moving away from fragmentation and returning to unity. It is ceasing to be an isolated particle to recognize oneself as the very field. The consciousness of Christ is not somewhere distant, waiting for us to be worthy of it. It is now, here, present, silent, loving, available, waiting only for the noise to cease, for the resistance to fall, for the being to surrender to the moment. Because in the present moment, the veil is torn. And when the veil is torn, the light that has always been there begins to shine without obstacles. And in this light, everything is remembered. Reintegration with the whole is not a fusion where the self is lost, but where the false self dissolves and the true self expands. It's like a drop that, upon falling into the ocean, does not get lost. It becomes the ocean. It becomes vastness. It becomes freedom. In silence, this expansion occurs without fuss, without spectacle, without the need to be noticed by anyone. It is intimate. It is sacred. It is transformative. And it is in this silence full of presence that the divine mind welcomes us back, not as imperfect beings seeking redemption, but as awakened consciousnesses returning to the home from which they never truly left. In every human being pulses a forgotten seed, a divine inheritance encoded in the depths of the spirit, waiting for the moment to germinate and break through the hardened soil of illusion. This seed is the inner Christ, not a name, not a doctrine, but a living consciousness that rests at the core of the being. Throughout the centuries, this Christ has been projected outward, transformed into an object of worship, a symbol of sacrifice, a distant deity. However, the true meaning of Jesus' coming was not to create adoration, but to inspire incarnation. He was the supreme example of what we all are in essence when free from the separate mind and reconnected to the source. The spiritual journey, therefore, is not the search for something new, but the awakening of something that has always been latent. The Christ in us, the immortal spark that vibrates beyond time and form, waiting to be recognized and fully manifested. This journey is similar to that of the hero described in ancient myths, perennial philosophies, and millennial spiritual traditions. It is the trajectory of the one who, feeling the discomfort of the known world, is called to cross the threshold of the ordinary and confront their own fears, shadows, and limitations. The spiritual hero, however, does not fight with external monsters, but with the inner dragons: pride, attachment, ignorance, guilt, fear. He needs to symbolically die to what he believed he was, so that he can be reborn as what he has always been. The inner Christ can only emerge when the old self dissolves. This is the invisible cross that every initiate is called to bear, not as punishment, but as a rite of passage, as the gateway between unconsciousness and the full light of being. The baptism of fire that precedes this birth is not gentle. It burns illusions, corrodes masks, dismantles identities zealously built throughout life. It is a painful process, yes, but profoundly liberating. For every layer that falls reveals the original purity that was always there. The ego, sensing its imminent dissolution, fights with all its might. It tries to convince the seeker that they are losing something. But nothing true is lost, only the artificial shells that hindered the expression of the divine. Jesus said, "Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it." He was not talking about physical death, but the death of the false self. The life that is lost is the illusion. The one found is the eternal truth. Throughout this journey, silence becomes a faithful companion. Not silence as the absence of sound, but as a full presence. The noisy mind begins to give way to luminous quietude. Intuition becomes clearer. Synchronicities intensify. The external reality begins to mirror the internal transformation. The inner Christ does not impose, does not shout, does not compete. He emerges gently, like the light that floods a dark room when a window is opened. And this light does not need words to reveal its origin. It speaks for itself. It heals without touch. It guides without a map. It transforms without effort. Not because it forces, but because it vibrates at a frequency that dissolves dense structures without resistance. At this point in the journey, the seeker realizes that they are no longer just walking. They are being walked. Something greater begins to guide the steps, choose the encounters, design the paths. Control gives way to trust. Rigidity yields to fluidity. The mind, once full of certainties, learns to live with questions. And in the space between questions and answers, the presence of Christ reveals itself. He does not offer dogmas, but consciousness. He does not impose rules, but reveals eternal principles. He is the silent guide who already knows the way, for he is the way himself. By becoming one with this consciousness, the seeker ceases to be someone who searches and becomes someone who manifests. The resurrection of Christ, often understood as a historical event, is actually a symbol of what happens within each being when the false dies and the real is born. It's not a miracle reserved for one man, but a universal possibility. The true resurrection happens here and now, whenever a human being abandons old mental structures and chooses to live from the light of being. It's a quiet, profound, revolutionary rebirth. Nothing changes, and at the same time, everything changes, because perception changes. And when the way of seeing changes, the lived reality changes. The cross is not a burden, but a key, a bridge between worlds, a symbol of integration between heaven and earth, spirit and matter, human and divine. By embodying the inner Christ, one ceases to be reactive and becomes creative. One stops repeating patterns and starts creating realities. The divine mind, accessed through silence and presence, becomes the source of action. Life is no longer lived to please, prove, compete, or conquer. It is lived to express, share, heal, and illuminate. Life ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a sacred stage, where the divine dances through the human. There is no longer a separation between sacred and profane, spiritual and everyday. Everything becomes spiritual because everything is lived from the awakened consciousness. Eating, walking, working, loving. Everything becomes liturgy. Everything transforms into an expression of presence. This state is not permanent at the beginning. It comes and goes like the waves of the sea, But each time it returns with greater strength, with more stability, with increased clarity, and over time, it becomes natural. The inner Christ ceases to be an experience and becomes a state of being. The divine mind becomes the ground you walk on, the air you breathe, the substance from which you live. Internal resistances dissolve, fears lose their power. Trust becomes absolute, not based on results, but on the silent certainty that everything is aligned with the greater good. This is true faith, not blind belief, but a deep, unshakable knowing that transcends logic and embraces the mystery. The spiritual hero's journey culminates not in personal glory, but in loving service. Anyone who awakens to the inner Christ understands that they are not here to save themselves alone, but to be a bridge for others. Not to impose truths, but to live in such a way that their very presence is a silent reminder of what is possible. This awakened being does not seek applause or followers. They walk among men with humility, compassion, wisdom. They touch with a glance, heal with silence, transform with presence. Not because they desire power, but because they have become a channel for the power that is pure love. They have become one with the Father, and everything they do is an expression of this union. At this point, the separation disappears. There is no longer the seeker and the sought. The path and the walker become one. Duality dissolves in the light of unity. The inner Christ, once ignored, now silently reigns in the temple of the heart. There is no longer a need to look outside for what has always been inside. There are no longer questions seeking answers. There is only the silence that contains everything. The being recognizes that it has always been what it was seeking. And this recognition is liberation. It is peace. It is fulfillment. It is the living gospel that walks the earth, not as someone special, but as someone who has finally remembered who they are. Living in awareness does not simply mean being attentive, but fully inhabiting the present moment, anchored in the deepest truth of being. It's when the divine mind becomes the center from which all thoughts, words, and actions manifest. This state is not theoretical. It is not confined to philosophical ideas or occasional practices. It's a way of existing that transforms everything, from the way one breathes to the way one perceives others. The presence of Christ-like consciousness in a human life is not measured by spiritual speeches, but by the silent vibration that this person carries when entering a room. It's the invisible scent of peace that remains after they have left. It's the subtlety of a gaze that welcomes without judgment, of a gesture that heals without touch, of a word that silences storms without needing to raise its voice. The embodied divine mind is loving force in action, and its impact on the world is not noisy, it's transformative. When this awareness begins to stabilize in the individual, the outside world no longer has the same power to disturb, divert, or control. The dramas once fueled by unconscious reactions are now seen as passing clouds in a sky of presence. The awakened being does not deny reality, but observes it with clarity and responds with wisdom. Emotions continue to arise, challenges continue to appear, but there is an inner lucidity that remains intact, even in the storms. This lucidity is the result of being rooted in the divine mind, which is not shaken by appearances, nor lost in illusions. The being living in this consciousness does not seek to escape life, but dives into it completely, recognizing that everything is an expression of the divine in varying degrees of remembrance or forgetfulness. This way of life generates a silent revolution. Where there was once conflict, there is now understanding. Where there was once judgment, there is now empathy. Where there was once haste, there is now presence. The divine mind, when embodied, reorganizes how the human being interacts with time, with the body, with relationships, and with existence itself. One no longer lives to achieve something in the future, but to express what is already present. Anxiety, the offspring of disconnection, begins to disappear. The fear of the unknown gives way to trust, and love, once conditioned by exchanges and guarantees, becomes unconditional, not because the being has become perfect, but because it has become true, and the truth liberates not only the individual, but everything around them. The vibrational field of someone in a Christ-conscious state is expansive, and its energy affects everything it touches. This impact is not mystical in the fanciful sense, but energetic, real, and measurable. Studies in neuroscience, epigenetics, and quantum physics already indicate how elevated states of consciousness influence the electromagnetic field of the heart, modify brain frequency, and alter cellular structure. But more important than scientific proofs is the experienced effect. Where there is true presence, there is spontaneous healing, restored harmony, revealed beauty. The divine mind in action doesn't need to prove its existence. It is perceived by the fruits it produces: serenity, compassion, clarity, truth. Living consciously also means choosing clearly. At every moment there is a fork in the road. To act from fear or love, from separation or unity, from scarcity or abundance. The common mind reacts automatically, guided by memories and conditioning. The divine mind responds with full awareness, unhurriedly, without judgment, with deep discernment. This response does not come from logic, but from the inner wisdom that is born from alignment with the self. And the more one practices this conscious choice, the more natural it becomes. What once seemed effort becomes the new, natural state of living. The external chaos no longer disturbs the inner center. The mind remains clear as a tranquil lake, even when the wind blows strong. In the presence of someone who lives in consciousness, others also begin to awaken. Not because they were taught, but because they were reminded. Awakening is contagious. It resonates. It reverberates in sleeping souls, like a bell ringing in the distance, awakening forgotten memories. This is the silent mission of those embodying the Christ consciousness, not to convert, but to reflect, not to impose, but to inspire. The divine mind has no interest in convincing. It simply is. And its presence alone is enough to break chains, dissolve walls, and open internal doors that have been locked for a long time. The world needs more living examples than elaborate speeches, and each being who chooses to live in consciousness becomes a silent beacon amidst the fog of collective forgetfulness. This new way of living also transforms the relationship with purpose. The old paradigm of success, based on achievements, external validations, and recognition, begins to crumble. In its place, purpose emerges as an expression of essence. One no longer works to earn or win, but to serve, to share, to contribute to the dance of life. The divine mind manifests gifts, talents, and abilities not for the individual to stand out, but for the benefit of the whole. Success becomes a natural consequence of authenticity, and abundance flows as a reflection of alignment with the flow of life. Everything done with awareness expands, flourishes, blesses. Living in consciousness also reconciles us with the body, which ceases to be seen as a spiritual obstacle or source of guilt. The body becomes a temple, channel, sacred instrument. Each cell begins to vibrate in harmony with the presence. Eating, moving, resting, loving, everything becomes a way to honor the divine that dwells in the flesh. The separation between matter and spirit is undone, and in this sacred marriage, life gains a simple but profound beauty. Pleasures are no longer a source of attachment, but expressions of the love that permeates everything. The body is no longer a slave to desire, but an ally of presence. And so, the incarnation of the inner Christ is completed. Heaven descends to earth through conscious living. Human relationships are also profoundly transformed. One no longer demands from others what one cannot give to oneself. There is no longer blame, projection, or dependence. Love becomes freedom. Communication becomes authentic. Bonds become mirrors for mutual growth. The divine mind recognizes the divine in others, even when they do not recognize it in themselves. And this perspective is, in itself, healing. Relationships cease to be a source of suffering and become laboratories of love, compassion, and evolution. Every encounter is sacred. Every separation is understood. Every word is chosen with intention. And thus, the world around begins to reflect the inner world. Finally, living consciously reconnects us with the earth, with nature, with all beings. The illusion of human superiority disappears. A deep respect for all forms of life emerges. The divine mind sees the spirit in the tree, in the river, in the animal, in the wind. The planet ceases to be a resource and becomes a sacred organism of which we are part. And this reconnection awakens a natural care, a sacred ecology, where life is honored in all its manifestations. The inner Christ is not just elevated consciousness, it is integrated, rooted, present, active consciousness. It transforms reality not by power, but by presence. And it is this presence that, little by little, is healing the world. Scarcity is not an absolute fact, but a distorted perception rooted in the separated consciousness. It is a reflection of the belief in lack, limitation, insufficiency, and that to obtain anything, one must compete, struggle, or deserve. This belief was not born in the material world, but in the mind that forgot its divine origin. The illusion of separation gave rise to fear, and fear gave birth to scarcity, a mental programming that spread through generations, cultures, and social systems, becoming almost invisible due to its apparent normality. However, the true spiritual reality knows no scarcity, because the divine mind is absolute fullness, an infinite source of creation, expansion, and expression. By connecting with the Christ consciousness, the human being discovers that abundance is their original nature, not something to be achieved, but something to be remembered, activated, and embodied. The abundance that arises from Christ consciousness is not limited to financial resources, although it also manifests on this plane. It is an inner state, a vibrational frequency that magnetizes experiences of fullness, synchronicity, generosity, and continuous flow. Living in abundance is living in alignment with the source, allowing life to flow without blockages created by fear, guilt, or feelings of unworthiness. When a human being sees themselves as part of the whole and not separated from it, they open themselves to receive without resistance, to give without fear of loss, and to circulate energy with full confidence. Divine consciousness is pure circulation. It never retains, never clings, never lacks. It's like the sun, shining without choice, without charge, without expecting return. So too is true abundance, an inner light that is shared incessantly. The root of scarcity, therefore, is not the lack of resources, but the lack of awareness. The lack of connection with the flow of life. The belief that the universe is hostile, indifferent, or limited. Many religious traditions have unwittingly reinforced the scarcity mindset by propagating the idea that suffering ennobles, that money is impure, or that desiring prosperity is a sign of selfishness. These beliefs have programmed entire minds to shy away from abundance as if it were a trap. However, Jesus, in manifesting the Christ consciousness, multiplied loaves and fishes, turned water into wine, walked on water, and lived with dignity, without scarcity. He did not reject matter, he transmuted it. He did not preach poverty, but inner freedom. Abundance was his nature, for he was united with the Father, the infinite source of all creation. To break free from the bonds of scarcity, it is necessary to confront these unconscious programmings. Observe the automatic thoughts that arise in the face of the possibility of expansion, success, or prosperity. How many times, when envisioning something grand, does the self-sabotage with phrases like, "It's not for me, I'm not lucky, it's too hard, I'm not capable"? These voices are not from the real self, but from conditioning. They are constructions of the ego based on past experiences, but they do not represent the now. The present moment, inhabited consciously, is fertile enough to transform any reality. And this transformation begins with vibration. It is not what the self thinks intellectually that creates, but what it vibrates constantly. Vibration is the language with which the divine mind communicates with the universe. The code of abundance is activated through surrender, trust, and gratitude. Surrendering to the flow of life is not passivity, but conscious surrender to the higher intelligence that organizes all things. It is knowing that there is a right time for every harvest and that apparent scarcity is often just an invitation to realignment. Trust is walking even without seeing the complete ground, knowing that it will form under your feet. And gratitude is acknowledging that the miracle is already underway, even before it manifests externally. Gratitude is not just a reaction to achievement, but a vibrational choice that precedes materialization. When a being vibrates gratitude, it emits a frequency compatible with abundance because it recognizes the presence of the divine in everything, even in phases of waiting or apparent emptiness. Generosity is another fundamental pillar of this frequency, not as a moral obligation, but as a natural expression of those who recognize that everything is in flux. To give is to pave the way to receive. Sharing is expanding. The divine mind does not withhold, for it knows that everything given with love returns multiplied. The inner Christ knows that abundance does not diminish when divided, it expands. This principle is visible in nature. A fruit-bearing tree does not fear that its fruits will end by feeding others. On the contrary, the more it gives, the more it strengthens. Similarly, the human being in consciousness understands that they do not possess, they only care. They do not accumulate, they only circulate. They do not cling, they only trust. And in this trust, everything arrives, everything manifests, everything flows. The frequency of abundance also demands vibrational responsibility. It's not enough to wish for prosperity. One must become one with it. This means cultivating aligned thoughts, elevated emotions, and attitudes consistent with the energy of divine supply. One cannot vibrate fear and expect security. One cannot sow doubt and reap confidence. The divine mind operates on perfect laws, and one of them is vibrational correspondence. What one emanates, returns. Therefore, living in abundance is a conscious, daily, active choice. It's a decision to align with the best, even when appearances scream the contrary. It's maintaining unwavering faith that everything needed is already available, just waiting for internal unlocking to manifest externally. Another essential aspect of this frequency is the long-term vision. The ego wants immediate results, instant rewards, constant confirmations. The Christ consciousness, on the other hand, understands time as a tool and not as a tyrant. It knows that preparation is part of the present, that the harvest will come in perfect timing, and that the invisible always precedes the visible. This understanding dissolves anxiety and strengthens perseverance. The being aligned with divine abundance does not run, it flows. It does not beg, it affirms. It does not demand, it trusts. And this vibrational posture is the fertile field where miracles become natural. Because the miracle is not a breach of divine laws, but a manifestation of them through unshakable faith. Living in this frequency also transforms the relationship with work, money, and material prosperity. Work ceases to be an obligation and becomes a mission. Money ceases to be an end and becomes a tool, and prosperity ceases to be accumulation and becomes flow. Everything reorganizes around the purpose of the soul. When the being does what it loves, serves the whole, and honors its gifts, life aligns to support it. The universe cooperates with those who cooperate with their own truth. The divine mind guarantees the necessary resources for those who walk with integrity, authenticity, and love. Scarcity in this context becomes merely a sign of misalignment, not a sentence, and by correcting the internal course, abundance returns as an inevitable reflection. In the end, true abundance is inner freedom. It's knowing that nothing outside can truly add or subtract value from the self. It's living in peace, with much or little, because the inner state does not depend on external fluctuations. It's being able to enjoy without attachment, share without fear, wait without anxiety, receive without guilt. The divine mind operates in this state of grace, where everything is enough, everything is perfect, everything is sacred, and by aligning with this mind, the self becomes a living channel of Christ-like abundance, healing not only its own life, but inspiring others to do the same. Scarcity, then, becomes a distant memory, and life begins to be lived with the lightness of one who knows that the universe is an infinite field of possibilities, always available to those who vibrate in the frequency of love, gratitude, and truth. There is a silent movement, invisible to distracted eyes, but palpable in the subtle field of those who feel with the soul. It is the emergence of a new humanity, not shaped by external structures or ideologies, but gestated from the reactivation of Christ consciousness in thousands, perhaps millions of hearts around the planet. This humanity does not define itself by race, nationality, religion, or social status, but by a vibrational frequency that transcends the dualistic mind. It does not seek external revolutions, but internal ones that, once consolidated, naturally transform the collective. To this silent current, Jesus referred to as the kingdom of God, not a geographical location, but a state of consciousness that manifests in each being who remembers their divine origin and decides to live in coherence with it. The mystical body of Christ is the invisible union of these awakened beings who, without dogmas or flags, become the living presence of the unwritten gospel, of the word that does not need to be spoken, because it is embodied. This body is not an institution, nor a new hierarchical structure. It is organic, fluid, multidimensional. It moves by love, is sustained by presence, and manifests through compassion. Each individual who awakens to their divine nature and lives from the divine mind begins to energetically integrate this mystical body. It is not a formal affiliation, but a resonant vibration. Like cells of the same cosmic organism, these consciousnesses do not need to know each other on the physical plane to be united in purpose. They vibrate in unison with the higher will of the whole, operate guided by the wisdom that emerges from silence, serve the world without losing themselves in the world. And each of them fulfills a specific, unique, unrepeatable role, like distinct notes composing a single spiritual symphony that echoes beyond time. This new humanity is not a utopia, but a real seed already sprouting amidst the chaos. All over the world, people are disconnecting from the old matrix based on fear, competition, and scarcity, and rediscovering a new command center, unified consciousness. They are transmuting old patterns of hatred, victimization, separation, and choosing forgiveness, presence, reconciliation. They are abandoning old limited identities to live from the essential self. They are discovering that it is possible to exist in a simple, truthful, abundant, and free manner. And this change does not happen through external imposition, but through an irresistible internal impulse, as if something very ancient is finally being remembered, activated, restored. The mystical body of Christ is the spiritual manifestation of unity in action. It's where theory dissolves into practice, where the word becomes flesh again, where the sacred descends from the altar to walk the streets. There is no room in this body for spiritual superiority, for competitions of virtue, or for the need to be right. Spiritual pride is purged by the light of true humility. Each member of this new humanity understands that they are here to serve, not to be served. That awakening is not an end in itself, but the beginning of a new stage, becoming an instrument of light. And the more one lives from this consciousness, the more latent gifts reveal themselves, the more talents expand, the more miracles become everyday occurrences, not for spectacle, but for vibrational coherence. The energy of this spiritual body organizes itself by affinity, not by control. Those who vibrate at similar frequencies are attracted to each other, forming invisible networks of cooperation, support, inspiration, and co-creation. These encounters are not by chance. They are orchestrated by the divine intelligence that governs the whole. And even though this body is not connected by human systems, it is profoundly cohesive because its glue is unconditional love. Love that recognizes the other as part of itself. Love that demands nothing to exist. Love that heals simply by being present. This is the true Christic network, not based on technology or institutions, but on the unified field of awakened consciousness. A field that quietly grows with each act of forgiveness, each choice for truth, each heart that opens to the divine. The new humanity is also anchoring a new relationship with the planet, with animals, with nature as a whole. By recognizing the sacredness of life in all forms, these beings cease to exploit and begin to care, cease to consume unconsciously and begin to honor. The inner Christ, when awakening in each one, also awakens ecological consciousness, not as an environmental obligation, but as an expression of universal love. The earth ceases to be a resource and becomes a living being, a spiritual organism that supports the experience of the human soul. And in this restored relationship, a new way of inhabiting the world begins to emerge. Lighter, more sustainable, more aware, more loving. The new humanity is also an ecological humanity, because it understands that spirit and matter are not separated. They are manifestations of the same light. The manifestation of this collective Christic body also reveals a new form of leadership, silent leadership, the kind that does not impose but inspires, that does not seek followers but awakens leaders, that does not dominate but serves. This leadership is born from the being who does not need to prove anything because it is already whole, who does not seek recognition because it is already at peace, who does not fuel divisions but builds bridges, and therefore its influence is immeasurable. It operates in an invisible but effective way. It transforms without the need for control. It educates by example, not by imposition. This is the leadership of the new era, a spiritual leadership based on integrity, coherence, presence. And those who exercise it are part of the mystical body of Christ, even if they have never pronounced that name. The impact of this new spiritual body on material reality can already be felt. Initiatives that promote healing, reconnection, self-awareness, environmental regeneration, restorative justice, conscious education, integrative health, and living spirituality are flourishing in every corner of the world. There isn't a single source centralizing these actions. They sprout in a decentralized, organic, spontaneous way. Each one of them is a cell of the collective body, and together, they are reshaping the contours of civilization. They are bringing to light a new paradigm of existence, where collaboration replaces competition, transparency dissolves fear, and presence replaces haste. The new humanity is not coming. It has already arrived. It is here. It is manifesting. It is living. This transformation does not require perfection, but sincerity. The mystical body of Christ is not composed of flawless beings, but of genuine ones, beings that recognize their shadows, but do not identify with them, that make mistakes, but learn, that fall, but rise with more awareness. The holiness of the new humanity is not rigid nor unattainable. It is humble, accessible, embodied. It is made up of ordinary people who have decided to live in an extraordinary way, people who do good without making a fuss, who listen with their hearts, who choose peace amidst chaos, who maintain faith when everything seems to crumble. This is the new face of Christ, multiple, plural, integrated, awakened. The birth of this new humanity is, in itself, the fulfillment of ancient prophecies. It is the realization of the promise that the kingdom of God would not come with outward signs, but would arise within us. It is the time when the pure in heart will see God, not as a distant being, but as the living presence in everything that is. It is the hour when the meek will inherit the earth, because they have understood that true power is that of non-resistance. It is the moment when the Word becomes flesh again, not in a single individual, but in a silent multitude walking with light in their eyes and peace in their heart. And when this new humanity reaches a critical point of vibrational mass, its light will be irresistible. The old structures will not fall by force or revolt, but by obsolescence. The lie will not withstand the presence of truth. Fear will not endure the radiation of love. Scarcity will disappear in the face of the awareness of abundance. And in this new world, there will no longer be a need for mediators between the human and the divine, because each being will be a living temple of the divine mind, a channel of wisdom, an instrument of compassion. The mystical body of Christ will no longer be invisible. It will be the regenerated world itself, inhabited by awakened, connected, unified souls. And in this world, heaven will no longer be above. It will be here, among us, within us, as it always has been. There is no greater revelation than that which does not need to be spoken. When the divine mind fully establishes itself in a human being, the gospel ceases to be a text, a belief, a doctrine, and becomes life in motion. The Word becomes flesh, and the flesh becomes the vehicle of the living Word, no longer as discourse, but as presence. At this point in the journey, the seeker is no longer just someone who is searching. They have become the one who manifests, the one who embodies, the one who carries within them the vibration of the creative Word. There is no longer any distance between what is believed and what is lived. Unity has been restored, and everything that is done, from the simplest gestures to the most grandiose acts, carries the invisible signature of the Christ consciousness. The being becomes a living gospel not because they intend to teach, but because they have become truth. They do not represent an idea, they are the embodied idea. To be the word that walks is to live in total vibrational coherence with universal truth. It is not only to know the principles of the inner Christ, but to allow these principles to govern thoughts, shape words, inspire actions, and guide each step. The being who lives in such a way does not need to announce themselves as awakened. Their life in silence announces it. Their vibration precedes their physical presence. Their energy precedes their speech. They enter a space and the frequency changes. Not because of personal power, but due to absolute alignment with the divine mind. They have become a field of healing, a point of emanation, a living beacon whose light is not extinguished by the winds of circumstance. And even without intention, their existence becomes an instrument of grace that operates through them. This stage of the journey is not reserved for the chosen, saints, or unreachable masters. It is available to all those willing to completely empty themselves so that the divine can fully inhabit. The process is radical. It requires total surrender, absolute honesty, unconditional submission. It requires the courage to abandon all masks, all forged identities, all desire for control. It requires a willingness to die to the world as it was known and to be reborn in the world as an expression of the source. Few surrender to this calling because it challenges all the structures of the ego, but those who accept discover a freedom that transcends human understanding. A freedom that does not depend on external circumstances, as it springs from the unshakable center of real presence. Being the living gospel is to walk through the world as a mirror that reflects the divine light without distortions. It is to act with wisdom where there is confusion, with tenderness where there is pain, with firmness where there is deviation. It is to welcome without absorbing, to guide without imposing, to teach without words. It is to be among men as one of them, but carrying within oneself the consciousness of the whole. The living gospel does not preach, does not convert, does not confront, it reveals. It allows the other to see themselves, to remember, to reunite. It serves without losing itself. It loves unconditionally. It listens with the soul. It moves with the breath of the Spirit and does not cling to place, function, recognition, or form. It is the very walking temple of the divine mind, and wherever it goes, it leaves traces of light that cannot be erased. This vibrant expression of Christ consciousness also represents the full realization of the I am, not as an affirmation of identity, but as a recognition of the source. The being no longer says, I am this or that, but only I am. Period, silence, wholeness. It doesn't need to explain its existence because it justifies itself in the direct experience of presence. Each breath becomes a prayer, each glance a sacrament, each word a seed. And by living this way, it becomes a direct agent of planetary transformation, not through effort, but through resonance. It doesn't try to change the world, it illuminates it with its simple presence, and this light changes everything around. The living gospel also understands that true prayer is not a petition, but an alignment. It's not about asking, it's about aligning. It's not about crying out for something external, but remembering that the kingdom is already within. Prayer becomes a continuous vibrational state, where the being remains anchored in the frequency of the source while performing their simplest tasks or their grandest projects. The spiritual is no longer separated from the everyday, the sacred from the common, the divine from the human. Everything is one. Everything is an expression of the same life, of the same presence. And therefore, any place becomes an altar. Any moment, eternity. Any gesture, liturgy. Living as the gospel is, above all, living as a channel. The channel has no content of its own. It serves as the passage for the content of the source. It does not attribute glory to itself, nor does it take pride in its fruits. It simply keeps itself clean, available, sensitive. And the more it empties itself, the more it can receive. The more it surrenders, the more it can flow. Being a channel requires constant vigilance, attention to one's own intentions, continuous purification of the ego. But it is not a burden, it is a sacred pleasure. It is a state where the greatest good is to be able to serve, where the greatest joy is to be able to love, where the greatest achievement is to become a bridge between heaven and earth. This is what Jesus represented, and this is what the new humanity is called to embody, not just to follow Christ, but to be Christ. This living gospel also recognizes that there are no longer any enemies. All who cross the path are mirrors, teachers, parts of the whole. Hatred disappears because there is no more separation. Judgment dissolves because there is understanding. Revenge loses its meaning because compassion has already healed. And so, the being that vibrates the divine mind walks through the world without hurting and without being hurt. Not because it is shielded, but because there is nothing left to defend. Their security comes from the recognition that they are the field itself. And in the field, everything is welcome, everything is integrated, everything is transformed. In becoming the word that walks, the being also becomes the fulfilled prophecy. They no longer wait for the golden age, they manifest it. They no longer yearn for a better world, they build it from within themselves. They no longer depend on leaders, gurus, or messiahs. They recognize that the resurrected Christ dwells in their own heart. And this realization doesn't generate pride, but reverence. A silent reverence for life, for the present moment, for the mystery that reveals itself with every breath. They begin to live with their feet on the ground, their heart in the heavens, and their soul in everything. They have become the bridge, the path, the light. The world doesn't need more speeches, systems, or theories. It needs beings embodied in truth. Beings who are the living gospel, the living peace, the living love. Beings whose entire existence is an offering to the whole. This is the mission of the New Age, the call of the divine mind, the legacy of the Christ consciousness. And for this, no titles, recognition, or external greatness are needed. All it takes is an available heart, a surrendered mind, and a lit soul. Just say yes. Just remember, just be. Because the being that becomes word transforms the world not by force, but by presence. And where there is presence, there is light. Where there is light, there is clarity. Where there is clarity, there is liberation. And where there is liberation, the gospel is fulfilled, not in pages, but in people, not in time, but in the eternal now, not in the heights, but right here, not in others, but in you. Mind unfettered, now it's up to you. What if the gospel was being written now, through you? How has the consciousness of Christ manifested in your life lately? Share in the comments an insight, an experience, or even a deep doubt. Here, every word of yours vibrates along with an awakening collective. Shall we manifest this new reality together? And the next step of your journey is already waiting for you. In the video next to this, the Book of 33 Steps, the Hidden Map. Jesus left for enlightenment. We reveal a forgotten map. The hidden steps left by Jesus for the ascension of the soul. Are you ready to tread this secret path? Click now and stay with us, Mind Unfettered. The journey hasn't ended. It has only just begun.